In the last video, we talked about authentication in ASP.NET Core. In this video, we'll talk about authorization. Authorization is also known as access control. So in a web application, what are these things that we try to control access to? Well, first, we can control access to certain URLs or URL patterns. For example, maybe we want to say only employees can access the URLs that start with employees. URL authorization is pretty efficient to implement, so if certain security constraints can be achieved through URL authorization, you should definitely do it that way. However, sometimes URL authorization is not enough. For example, suppose we want to implement a restriction that says an employee can only access a project if the employee is a member of the project. This is not something that can be done easily with URL authorization. In fact, in order to check if an employee can access a project, we have to first load the project from the database, then check if the employee is a member of the project. In this example, the project is called a resource, which is typically an object in our application. Resource authorization basically lets us control access to objects. And then there's view authorization. This means that we should hide actions that a user cannot perform from their user interface. For example, suppose only administrators can add new employees. We should hide the Add Employee button if the current user is not an administrator. In this video, we'll illustrate the capabilities of ASP.NET Core authorization with a few examples. These examples are based on the employees example we've been developing, but you can see that these are pretty common requirements that apply to many other applications. Specifically, will require that only authenticated users can access employee management functions. Only administrators can add new employees. Administrator can view/edit all employees, where a regular employee can only view/edit their own information. And finally, operations not available to a user should be hidden from the user in their views. The first one is easy to implement. In fact, we already know how to do it from the last video. All we need to do is put the authorize attribute on the employee's controller, and all the action methods in the controller would require authenticated user. So it's something like this. So last time we put authorize on details, and this time we'll put it here, and this would meet the requirements that all employee management functions require authenticated user. So if we try this one, it's redirecting us to the login page, and if we log in as John, we can access all the employee management functions. As we talked about in the last video, Authorize requires the user to be authenticated. It can be used on controllers and action methods, so it's basically a way to do URL authorization, as controllers and action methods correspond to URLs and URL patterns. Another attribute that's often used in conjunction with Authorize is AllowAnonymous. If we use Authorize on a controller like this, we can use AllowAnonymous action method to kind of override Authorize. For example, if we put AllowAnonymous here, then this employee index action would allow all users to perform, not just authenticated users, while other methods will require authenticated users. So it's kind of convenient where we can specify authorize for most of the methods, but override it with allow anonymous on some of those methods. Okay, now let's look at the second example. Here we want only administrators to add new employees. Notice that in the last example, the authorization condition is authenticated user, which is a standard condition. We didn't need to specify or describe that condition because the framework already had it built in. This, of course, is not always the case. For example, here the condition is basically that the user has the isAdmin claim. Remember last time when we did authentication, we did the claim principal thing, and when a user logs in, we specify 3 claims: name identifier for ID, name for name, and isAdmin for whether the employee is admin. So here the condition is basically the user has a claim whose type is admin and whose value should be true. Now, this is an application-specific condition the framework doesn't know about, so we'll need to define this condition ourselves. The code is pretty simple. We just need to add authorization service and add something called a policy. So let's do that. And as we know, services are added in configure services. Let's put it here. And this would add a policy called isAdmin with a requirement that says this user must have a isAdmin claim whose value is true. Once we have that policy, we can use it in the authorize attribute like this. So we can go back to employees controller and put it here. And this one basically says add would require an authenticated user, and in addition to that, it also needs to meet the policy that's called isAdmin. And we'll need to put it on both the get method and the post method because a user can send either a get request or a post request. Okay, with these two in place, let's try this again. If I go to employees, redirect to login, let's log in as John, who is an admin user. And if I click add, we can add new employees. Now let's log out and log in as Jane, who is not an admin user. And if I click add, it doesn't work. The authorization part works, but we are missing a access denied page. Remember, this looks like what we saw last time when we were missing a login page and a logout action. And same thing here. If we look at the URL, we can see that the URL is /account/access denied, and then request parameter called return URL, which is very similar to the login operation. Now, knowing this, we know that all we need to do is to have an account controller and access denied method, and account controller we already have from last time, and we just need to add a access denied method here, and this method doesn't really do anything other than just return a page, and the page of course should be under account folder and with the name access denied, and here we want to say access denied. And I also want to use Bootstrap alert. So let's go to Bootstrap, and this is Bootstrap 5. The project template, I think if I'm not mistaken, is still using Bootstrap 4. Anyway, we go to Bootstrap 4 and look for alert. Yes, alert. We'll need alert danger. Okay, so let's grab this one and put it here. Okay, so let's try this again. Let's log out first, and we'll log in as Jane. If Jane tries to add an employee, the view access denied is not found. Oh, it has the wrong name. We need to rename it. We cannot rename it while it's running. Okay, let's rename it. It should be called access denied, not access denied CSHTML. Let's try one more time. Okay, so access denied, and let's log out, log in as John. And John can add without any problem. Okay, so now that everything works, let's talk a little bit more about policy, the thing we just added here. Policy. A policy is basically an authorization condition with a name. Some conditions can be simple, like authenticated user, or a user has a claim called isAdmin. But sometimes conditions can be more complex. For example, we may have a condition that says only users with a certain claim and from certain IP addresses and during certain period of time can perform certain operations. The benefit of having policy is basically that we can define a policy once or define a condition once, then use it everywhere instead of programming the same thing at multiple places. Even in our simple example, we can see that the same policy is used in two methods instead of repeating the same code twice in the two methods. It also makes changing conditions easier because we only need to change it once at one place. In our example, we use Policy Builder to build the policy. Policy Builder provides a few methods like require authenticated user, require username, require claim, and so on. Basically, methods we can use to build a simple policy based on authentication status, username, and some claims. Sometimes we need to build a more complex policy, and we can do that by using requirements and handlers. A policy can have one or more requirements, and each requirement can have one or more handlers to check if the requirement is met. The relationship among requirements is AND, meaning all requirements must be met in order to pass the policy check. The relationship among the handlers for a requirement is OR, meaning that we only need one handler to return true to consider the requirement met. By creating requirements and handlers, we can build pretty complex policies. Now let's see an example that requires a custom policy with a requirement and a handler. In this example, we'll allow an administrator to view/edit all employees, but an employee can only view/edit their own information. This is an example of resource authorization, which is needed when we cannot do URL authorization. Notice that in URL authorization, we have a URL and the current user, and we make a decision whether the user can access the URL. However, sometimes the URL itself does not provide enough information for us to make the decision, and in those cases, we need resource authorization. In ASP.NET Core, it's usually implemented as a custom policy, and then we use the authorization service to evaluate the policy on a particular object, aka a resource. Here's the process of creating a custom policy. First, we create one or more requirements. Then we create one or more authorization handlers to handle each requirement. Then in startup, we create a policy, add the requirements to the policy, and register the handlers as services. Let's start by creating the requirement. Usually, I like to have a folder called security, where I put all my policy and security related code. So let's create a security folder first. And then I also like to have the requirements and handlers for one particular policy in the same file. So let's create a file called can access employee policy. Can access employee policy. Okay, so there's actually no class called can access employee policy. I just want to put the requirement and the handler here. The requirement will be called can access employee requirement. So it's pretty simple. A requirement has to implement this authorization requirement interface. Most of the time, that's it. We don't actually need to do anything extra. This is because most of the time, we really just need the name for the requirement. and the actual code to check the requirement will be in the handler. And the only thing we really need is just the name of the requirement. Now, to implement a handler, we need to inherit from authorization handler class. For resource authorization, we'll need to inherit from the second one. It's a generic class. The first type parameter is the type of the requirement, and the second type parameter is the type of the resource we try to authorize access to. So we'll say something like public class, we'll call it access employee handler, and it will inherit from this generic class, and the first type is the type of the requirement, which of course is can access employee requirement. Now the second type parameter is the resource type, which would typically be a class like employee. But in our case, we actually don't need the full employee object. The reason is that both view employee and edit employee will pass as an employee ID parameter. We can actually just use employee ID to check if the user can access the employee without loading the full employee object from the database. So here we can actually have the resource type to be int. So in other words, we are just try to do the authorization based on employee ID rather than a full employee object. Okay, so the superclass is an abstract class, and we'll have to implement this method called handle requirement async. So what do we do inside this method? Notice that this method gives us three parameters: context, requirement, and the resource, which will be the ID of an employee. Now, there's really nothing in our requirement class, but the context parameter actually gives us quite a lot. So the context parameter gives us the principal, which we can use to check claims. It also gives us two methods, succeed and fail, which we will call depending on whether the check is successful or not. So inside the code, we can then check if the user is admin or if the user's ID is the same as the employee ID. So something like that. The code will be something like if context user, which is the principal and has claim, and if it has a claim called is admin with a value true, then we would consider the requirement met, or this user has a claim and has a claim name identifier, and this claim is the same as employee ID toString, something like this. Again, remember last time when we log in a user, we set a name identifier claim to be the ID of the employee. So here we're basically checking if that identifier matches the ID of the employee we try to access. If that is the case, we'll say context succeed requirement. So admin or have the same ID. And do we need another parenthesis? Okay. And once we are done, because this is a async method that returns a task, we simply return completed task. So something like this. Okay, so now we have our requirement and our handler. Now the next step is to create a policy based on these two. So we'll add this policy to our authorization service. Where is it? Here. So this one, okay. So this policy will be called can access employee, and it will have a requirement called can access employee requirement, which was the requirement we created. And then we'll need to register the handler for that requirement, which will be something like this. And let's register it here. Okay, so this one is a handler we just created, and we register it under the type authorization handler. And notice that authorization handlers are usually registered as a scoped service. Okay, so now that we have the policy in place, then we can check it in code. But we'll first need to inject an authorization service into a controller in order to check it. So that means we'll need to inject what's it called? Authorization service. Okay. So we'll do private read only and authorization service. And we'll need to inject it. Authorization service. Authorization service. And this one is this one. Okay. So once we have that, we can then do the checking. And the checking is done like this. We'll say authorization service, authorize async, and then pass the principal, which is the current user, the resource, and then the policy name. And then we check if the result is successful. If it's successful, we continue. If it's not, we return a forbidden, we return a forbid result or forbidden result. Anyway, that either way, it means it means access denied. So let's grab this code, and we'll need to put this code in details. Why do I have view back? Anyway, let's just leave it there. So auth result will be authorization service, authorization, and the server, not server, user, and the ID is can access employee. That's the policy name, right? And if it's not succeeded, the return forbid result. And because this one is async, we need to make the method async. So something like this, right? Okay, so we'll need to do the same for edit as well. So let's put edit here. Let's put it here for edit, and let's put it here for edit as well. Okay, so let's see. And let's log in as John, the administrator, and we go to employees. John can see John and can see Jane, can edit everybody. And so John can do anything. And let's log in as Jane. If Jane tries to view John's detail, access denied. If Jane tries to edit Tom, access denied. But if Jane tries to view Jane's detail, that's fine. And edit Jane's detail, and that's fine. So it works. Okay, so now let's look at view authorization. Basically saying that we should hide operations from a user if the user cannot perform those operations. For example, for a regular user, we should not show details and edit link for the other users. View authorization in ASP.NET Core is basically works the same as resource authorization because views are also C# classes like the controllers. We just need to inject the authorization service into view and then do basically what we did in the previous example. So for example, let's see. This is the current view. I think I'm logged in as Jane, right? Okay, so let's go to that page. And then let's inject authorization service using the inject directive. And is authorize authorization service. We'll call it authorization service, something like that. Oh, because this is a view, we don't have import or using on this page. We'll have to give it the full name. The full name of the class would be, this is the namespace, to include the namespace and authorization service. Okay, so now we have this, and then basically if we want to have something, we do a if statement. So let's say we want to hide the edit link, which would be this one. So we'll say if something, and the inside if we'll do the check against the policy. we'll say await authorization service, authorize async, and yes, we do have employee ID. I think I'm messing up parentheses. So we do await. Okay, so let me. If. Okay, so we'll do await this and this and this and this and succeeded. Okay, I think that. Yeah, so that's the right amount of parentheses. Okay, all right. So this one basically says if we authenticate the current user against this resource using this policy, and this is successful, it shows added. And if we run this, okay, great. So we only see added for Jane. And similarly, we can deal with the details link. So details link will be something like this. Let me copy over this if. So we'll say if this thing succeeded, we'll show the link, and else we'll just show the name. And okay, so now all the other names are unlinked, and we only see the link to Jane. And we can do one more thing. This add operation can only be performed by administrators. So let's get rid of that one. And where is that add? Okay, so it's here. So again, we'll do a if. Oops, not this one. Let's copy this. If. And let's put add here. Okay, so notice that here we are actually going to check a different policy. So this policy is not the can access employee policy. It's actually the is admin policy. So this one should be is admin policy. And also this is admin policy is not a resource authorization policy, meaning that it does not require a resource object. It simply uses the current user to authorize. So the resource parameter should be null. Okay, so user is admin null resource. And okay, so now if we are logged in as Jane, this is what we see. Let's log in as John instead, and we see all the links, and all of them also work. Okay, so this is how we do authorization in ASP.NET Core. I think there are two things that are worth highlighting. First is the support for the so-called declarative security through the Authorize tag. Declarative security means we declare security constraints using metadata or configuration. Declarative security is generally preferable over the so-called programmatic security, where we have to implement security by programming. The second important thing is the policies, which allow us to centralize security code, then inject it into different parts of the application. It also makes security implementation and management a lot easier. Okay, so this is the end of this video. Please check out chapter 15 of the ASP.NET Core book. Thanks and see you in the next one.